We just got some major leaks revealing Apple's work on an OLED MacBook Air, which is a massive deal because every MacBook for decades has always come with an LCD display, so this would be a display revolution, especially by including the dynamic island. However, with all good sets of news, there's always a little bit of bad news. But before I get into that, I've got to talk about the difference between LCD and OLED. With a typical LCD display, which means liquid crystal, you have an entire backlight as the light source that goes through layers like the polarizing filters, the color filters, and then that comes out as colored light. Now, there are also LCD displays that come with local dimming, like Apple's Pro Display XDR, which is very similar to an LCD display, but instead of having a full white panel for the light, it uses these small local areas with very powerful blue LEDs, and then the light goes through a bunch of color mixing and shaping layers to become what you see with a mini LED display, where you have higher contrast ratios because parts of the display are completely turned off. And then on OLED displays, instead of having a full white backlight unit, the light actually comes from each individual organic LED chip. And the main benefit of that is that when you have areas that are dark or black, it's actually very, very dark and black because the OLED chips themselves are completely turned off, like you can see in this video where you have kind of text right here, but once you zoom in, you can see each individual LED chip that's being lit up with all these colors to create white, but these black areas are completely turned off, so you have an infinite contrast ratio that looks amazing. But on an LCD display, even when the whole image is black, the backlight is always on because it has to be, so that's why it looks very gray at night. Now, Apple's mini LED display helps with that, but you do have a halo glowing effect in the high contrast areas. OLED doesn't have any issues with that, and it can even save you battery life when showing dark or black images on the screen because the pixels are off and not using any power. And that is why this OLED MacBook Air is going to be so revolutionary. So let's get into this leak. We just got this leak from The Elec reporting that an OLED MacBook Air is currently in development, and Samsung Display is working on it right now, so it is definitely coming, and they're even making even better, more advanced displays for the MacBook Pro, which I'll get into in just a minute. And that new leak actually matched up to something that Ross Young said before, saying that an OLED MacBook Air is coming, and it was supposed to be launching in 2024. However, we have our bad news. He just gave us an update saying that we are going to be getting a MacBook Air with OLED, but it's going to be a little bit smaller. 13.4 inches instead of 13.6, and I'll get into why in just a minute, but the bad news is that it's not coming until 2026. Yes, 3 years from now until we finally get this OLED MacBook Air. And the question is, why is this happening so late? Well, in my opinion, I believe that this OLED display has to come to the MacBook Pro first, and I think it's gonna be a dual stack OLED display, which I'm gonna explain. But first, before that MacBook Pro, I believe that the OLED iPad Pro has to come first according to all of the leaks, and the reason it makes sense is because we have rumors saying that the OLED panels are going to cost 2 to 3 times more, which makes sense with a dual stack OLED. That's why it's going to be so expensive. So what is a dual stack OLED? Well, let me explain. Well, first of all, that dual stack OLED leak actually matches to an old one from November of 2021, saying that future iPad Pro and MacBook Pro models will have an ultra bright double stack OLED display. And you can see on the left right here, you have a single stack, but on the right, you have a tandem or dual stack with basically the same thing stacked twice. And you can see right here, it increases brightness by 1.5 to 2 times brighter. And that is extremely important for Apple. Now, in my opinion, I believe that all of the regular or cheaper iPad models are getting the single stack display, while the iPad Pro and MacBook Pro models will get the dual stack OLED display, which will be twice as bright, which is very important because when Apple redesigned the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, they gave it a mini LED display, and they even explained why. They said that it allows them to reach 1600 nits of peak brightness for HDR content, which OLED at the time could not do because OLED displays are quite a bit dimmer. However, dual stack OLED completely solves that issue with brightness, and there's no halo effect like we have on the mini LED displays. So essentially, these new dual stack OLEDs will be the king of all displays. And now let's get into the dynamic island idea and why I think it's coming to both the OLED iPad Pro and all MacBook models with OLED displays, including the MacBook Air. Now, going back to the recent leak from Ross Young saying that the OLED display on the MacBook Air is going to be 13.4 inches, the weird thing about that is that the current MacBook Air display is 13.6. So why would Apple downgrade the display? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go back to the M1 MacBook Air, which had a 13.3-inch display, and ask why they put it up to a 13.6-inch. Well, first of all, they slimmed the bezels all around, which added about 0.1 inches of display space, and then the additional 0.2 inches was actually added to the top of the display, just like what happened to the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro models, and that was specifically added for the notch so that when the upper bar is disabled when watching full screen media, you still get the same perfect aspect ratio and scaling that you got before. So basically, if Apple is removing that 0.2 inches of display space, that means they're probably getting rid of the notch on all OLED MacBook display models. But the problem with that is the webcam. Where does it go? Because it's not gonna fit in the very slim bezels without the notch, right? Well, no. If Apple brings the dynamic island to all OLED MacBooks, they'll be able to easily fit the camera and Face ID sensors, yes, Face ID on the MacBooks, by moving all of that just a little bit lower down on the display, just like they've done on the iPhone Pro models with the dynamic island, which you can see right here is a little bit lower than it was before. Now you might ask, why wouldn't Apple just bring the dynamic island to the MacBook Pro models right now instead of waiting? Well, that's because LCD displays are very tough to cut. For example, Apple had a lot of issues with cutting a notch into the LCD iPhone XR display, which had a lot of quality control and display panel loss issues. So basically, Apple is waiting to bring the dynamic island to the iPad Pro and MacBooks until the OLED displays are ready to go. Now here's the final nail in the coffin for the dynamic island idea, and it has to do with the latest iPad Pro, which is actually missing the landscape camera that came to the budget iPad. And the reason it doesn't have the landscape camera is because the spot for the camera is exactly where the wireless charger is for the Apple Pencil 2. And as you can see in this X-ray, the landscape camera would not fit between the bezel. It would have to go into the display. However, by switching to the dynamic island, the whole setup with Face ID would move down a little bit into the display, allowing enough room for those sensors and camera and the wireless charger for the Apple Pencil 2 at the same time, essentially being the perfect solution. So if Apple is going to implement the dynamic island on the iPad Pro, then why not bring it to the MacBook models as well, starting with all of the OLED displays, basically making it a huge and very unique feature exclusive to Apple, with the dynamic island being the central hub for notifications and everything else across all of those products. And that's what I think is gonna happen. If you completely disagree with me, let me know down in the comment section below. But if you enjoyed the video, click the circle above to subscribe and check out one of those two videos right there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.